The winter of 1996 moved across the North Dakota plains with a weight that seemed to accumulate without pause. November brought snow. December brought more. January arrived with blizzards that buried fence posts and railroad crossings under drifts that reached second-story windows in some towns. The snow did not melt. It stayed, compressing under its own mass, layer upon layer, while temperatures held below freezing for weeks at a time. Across the Red River Valley, the snowpack grew deeper than anyone had measured in decades. In Grand Forks, the accumulated snow reached heights that obscured street signs. Farm equipment disappeared beneath white expanses that stretched unbroken to the horizon. The landscape became simplified, reduced to gentle rises and depressions, all contours softened under several feet of snow that glittered in the low winter sun. The Red River itself, running north along the border between North Dakota and Minnesota, froze solid. The ice thickened through December and January, forming a rigid cap several feet deep in places. Below the surface, water continued to flow, but above, the river became part of the static winter landscape. Ice fishermen drilled through 30 inches of solid ice. Vehicles crossed certain sections without concern. February added more storms. The snow total for the season climbed past 100 inches in some locations, double the normal amount. Weather stations recorded the measurements with growing attention. Each new storm added to a snowpack already far exceeding historical averages. The weight pressed down on roofs. Municipalities dispatched crews to remove snow from flat-topped buildings to prevent collapse. By late February, residents of the valley understood they were facing an unusual spring. Weather reports cataloged the snowpack measurements. Hydrologists began issuing flood forecasts. The numbers indicated significant flooding was likely, perhaps reaching levels last seen in 1979. Communities along the river prepared sandbags and reviewed evacuation routes. There was concern, but it existed within familiar parameters. The valley had flooded before. Preparations were made with the knowledge that spring always brought some degree of high water. March arrived cold. The snow remained. Then in the middle of the month something shifted. Warm air moved up from the south, not gradually but in a sustained push that raised temperatures 20, then 30, then 40 degrees above normal. The wind came with it, steady and insistent, carrying warmth that began working on the snowpack immediately. The ice on the river, thick and solid through the long winter, began to weaken from above and below. Meltwater started moving across frozen ground that could not absorb it. The weight of winter, accumulated over 5 months, began its inevitable descent toward the lowest point in the landscape. The Red River Channel, flowing north toward Canada through one of the flattest regions on the continent. The thaw, when it began in earnest, did not proceed in stages. The warmth arrived and stayed, and the snowpack that had taken months to build began collapsing within days. Water ran off rooftops, filled ditches, spread across fields still frozen beneath the surface. The ground, locked solid to a depth of several feet, could not accept the meltwater. Everything that melted had nowhere to go but downhill, following gravity toward the river. The Red River's ice began breaking apart unevenly. In some sections, the ice lifted and fragmented into massive plates that began moving downstream. In other sections, particularly where the channel narrowed or bent, ice jams formed. These blockages created temporary dams, backing water up behind them until pressure built sufficiently to break through or force water around the obstruction. Each jam shifted the flooding upstream, spreading water laterally across the valley floor. The river's northward flow created a fundamental problem. Spring arrived first in the southern portions of the watershed, while ice remained solid farther north. Water and ice from the south moved toward sections still frozen, creating collision points where everything backed up. The flat terrain offered no relief. With almost no gradient to accelerate flow, water spread outward rather than channeling downriver. The Red River Valley sits on the bed of ancient Lake Agassiz, a massive glacial lake that drained thousands of years ago. The terrain it left behind possesses almost no topographic relief. The river drops only about 1 foot per mile in some sections. This minimal gradient means water moves slowly under normal conditions. During extreme flooding, it barely moves at all, simply expanding horizontally across the landscape. Rain began falling in late March. Not heavy precipitation, but steady enough to add volume to a system already overwhelmed. The combination of rapid snowmelt and rainfall exceeded the river's capacity within days. By early April, the Red River at Grand Forks measured flood stage and continued rising. The valley began transforming. Water spread beyond the defined river channel, moving into low-lying agricultural land first, then approaching roads and the outer edges of towns. The flooding did not advance as a defined wave but as a gradual expansion, water finding every depression and filling it, then rising incrementally, claiming ground by the hour. Forecasters revised their predictions upward repeatedly. Initial estimates of a crest around 49 feet gave way to projections of 51 feet, then 53. Grand Forks flood protection infrastructure had been designed for a 51-foot flood based on previous historical data and engineering assumptions. As April progressed and water continued rising, it became clear those protections would not hold. Emergency preparations intensified. Volunteers filled sandbags by the hundreds of thousands. Temporary dikes extended for miles around vulnerable areas. The National Guard deployed. Schools closed and converted to evacuation centers. The work continued around the clock, but the river kept rising, indifferent to human effort. The sandbag dikes around Grand Forks began failing on the night of April 17th. Water found weak points in the barriers, small seeps at first that rapidly eroded into breaches. Once compromised, the temporary levees collapsed in sections, and water poured through the gaps into residential neighborhoods. The flooding arrived at night. Residents who had stayed to defend their homes watched water advance down streets, visible in the glow of streetlights that still functioned. The water moved with steady purpose, not rushing but persistent, filling basements first, then rising to first floors. By morning, entire neighborhoods stood submerged. The water carried the smell of river mud and debris. It was cold, brown, and opaque, obscuring everything beneath its surface. Furniture floated inside houses. Cars parked on streets disappeared gradually, their roofs remaining visible for a time before submerging completely. The floodwater was not deep in the dramatic sense, rarely exceeding 8 or 10 feet in most areas, but in a landscape this flat, that depth was sufficient to transform the city. Buildings began shifting. Houses built on standard foundations, not designed for prolonged water contact, started moving slightly as soil beneath them softened. Some tilted noticeably. Others separated from their foundations entirely, floating briefly before settling at odd angles. The structural damage occurred quietly, incrementally, while water continued its lateral spread. Trees stood submerged to their lower branches. Stop signs jutted from water at odd heights depending on street elevation. The city's geometry remained intact, but had been translated into an aquatic environment. Mailboxes marked the edges of driveways now several feet underwater. Chain-link fences created barely visible hazards just below the surface. Rescue operations proceeded systematically. Boats moved through residential streets checking each house. Personnel called out, knocked on doors, waited for responses. Most residents had already evacuated, but some remained, reluctant to abandon homes they had spent days trying to protect. The rescues proceeded calmly, without panic, each extraction a matter of practical logistics. On April 18th, fire broke out in downtown Grand Forks. The blaze started in one building and spread rapidly to adjacent structures. Under normal circumstances, the fire department would have responded within minutes, but downtown Grand Forks was underwater. Fire trucks could not reach the burning buildings. Boats could navigate the flooded streets but carried no firefighting equipment capable of controlling a major structure fire. The fire burned unchecked. 11 buildings in the historic downtown district ignited, flames rising above the floodwater while smoke drifted across the submerged city. Residents watching from evacuated positions outside the flood zone could see the orange glow reflecting off the water's surface. The scene defied normal disaster logic, buildings burning while surrounded by water deep enough to prevent any intervention. Grand Forks downtown, parts of which dated to the city's founding in the 1870s, burned through the night of April 18th and into April 19th. The fire consumed block after block while water lapped at the bases of the burning structures. Emergency personnel watched from boats, unable to act as the fire ran its course. The flames illuminated the flood, casting orange light across the water's surface, creating reflections that moved with the current. The buildings that burned included retail stores, offices, restaurants, and historic landmarks. Many had survived for more than a century, through previous floods, through economic changes, through multiple generations of ownership. The fire removed them in hours. Walls collapsed inward. Roofs caved. By dawn on April 19th, what had been functioning structures were skeletal remains, blackened timber and exposed brick standing in floodwater that showed no signs of receding. By April 20th, the Red River at Grand Forks crested at 54.35 feet, more than 4 feet higher than the city's flood protection could withstand, and the highest level ever recorded at that location. The flooding extended far beyond the immediate riverbanks. Water covered approximately 75% of the city. Entire residential districts stood submerged. Major roads became impassable waterways. The city's infrastructure, designed for normal conditions, failed systematically as water infiltrated power stations, overwhelmed sewage systems, and rendered transportation networks useless. Evacuation became total. More than 50,000 people left Grand Forks and its sister city, East Grand Forks, Minnesota. The exodus proceeded in stages as different neighborhoods succumbed to rising water. Some residents departed in their own vehicles, driving through shallow flooding on roads still barely passable. Others required boat rescue as water rose around homes they had tried to defend. Emergency personnel moved through flooded areas in flat-bottomed boats, checking houses, assisting anyone who remained. The flooded city took on qualities more associated with marine environments than urban landscapes. Streets became channels. Intersections formed shallow pools where currents from different directions converged. Boats navigated using street signs and building tops as landmarks. Familiar geography became disorienting when viewed from water level. A city built for vehicles and pedestrians now accommodated only watercraft and the occasional amphibious rescue vehicle. The downtown fire zone remained visible for days, skeletal structures standing amid the floodwater. The burned buildings' brick walls endured, but interiors were gutted. Roofs had collapsed. What had been functioning commercial buildings now stood as hollow shells, blackened and exposed. The juxtaposition of fire damage and flood damage in the same district illustrated the disaster's compound nature. Throughout the flooded region, the landscape had transformed completely. Aerial photographs showed water extending for miles beyond normal river boundaries. The Red River Valley had returned, temporarily, to conditions resembling its glacial past. Towns appeared as small islands of elevated ground surrounded by vast, shallow expanses of water. Highway overpasses rose from the flood like bridges spanning an inland sea. The disaster's scale became apparent only from altitude, where the extent of inundation could be comprehended fully. What had been agricultural fields, residential areas, and commercial districts now formed a continuous body of water stretching to the horizon. Power grids failed progressively. Substations flooded. Transmission lines remained intact but had no functioning distribution network. Most of Grand Forks went dark. At night, the flooded city appeared almost entirely black except for emergency lights on rescue vehicles and distant reflections from fires that continued burning in inaccessible areas. The flooding extended beyond Grand Forks. Communities up and down the Red River faced similar inundation. Oslo, Norway Township, Climax, Crookston, each dealt with water levels far exceeding protection measures. The regional nature of the disaster meant that resources were stretched thin, with multiple communities requiring simultaneous assistance. The water held its peak for several days, then began receding slowly. The drop was gradual, measured in inches per day rather than feet. As water levels fell, the scope of destruction became visible. Mud coated everything, thick deposits that hardened in the spring air. Streets remained clogged with debris, sediment, and damaged vehicles. Buildings that had stood underwater for weeks emerged stained and structurally compromised. Grand Forks residential neighborhoods revealed extensive damage. Homes that had been submerged showed water lines on their exterior walls marking the flood's high point. Interiors were destroyed. Drywall had disintegrated. Flooring buckled. Insulation hung sodden from ceiling joists. Appliances were ruined. Personal belongings, if not removed before evacuation, were lost. The smell of standing water and beginning mold pervaded everything. Returning residents faced decisions about salvage versus demolition. Some homes could be gutted and rebuilt. Others had sustained structural damage, rendering them unsafe. Foundation shifts, prolonged water exposure, and compromised load-bearing elements meant many buildings needed complete removal. The sorting process proceeded house by house, block by block. The downtown fire zone presented a different kind of devastation. Approximately 11 buildings had burned, some completely, others partially. The fires had consumed historic structures that had anchored downtown Grand Forks for more than a century. Walking through the burned blocks required navigating charred timber, collapsed masonry, and twisted metal. What had been a functioning commercial district now resembled a war zone. Cleanup began with heavy equipment. Front-end loaders removed debris. Dump trucks hauled away damaged contents. Crews power-washed buildings to remove mud. The work generated enormous volumes of waste. Everything flood-touched required disposal. The regional landfill received tonnage far exceeding normal capacity. Rebuilding began from a foundation of nearly total loss. Infrastructure required complete overhaul. Water treatment systems, power distribution, roads, bridges, all needed reconstruction. The city's water plant had been submerged. Electrical substations required rebuilding. Sewer lines needed inspection and repair throughout the flood zone. The scope of work stretched beyond anything the local workforce could manage alone. Federal assistance arrived. FEMA established offices. The Army Corps of Engineers deployed. Funding streams opened for both emergency relief and long-term reconstruction. Insurance companies processed thousands of claims. Many homeowners discovered their policies did not cover flood damage, a common gap in coverage that left families facing total loss with minimal compensation. Thousands of homes were deemed uninhabitable and required demolition. The removal process took months. Each structure had to be disconnected from utilities, inspected for hazardous materials, then systematically dismantled. The resulting empty lots created gaps in formerly continuous neighborhoods. Some blocks lost half their houses. Others were cleared entirely. The burned downtown blocks faced decisions about preservation versus clearance. Some building owners chose to reconstruct. Others sold their properties. The city developed plans for downtown revitalization, but implementation would extend across years. For a long period, the burned zone remained largely empty, a visible reminder of the disaster's compound nature. Across the region, communities implemented new flood control measures. Grand Forks constructed an extensive system of permanent levees and flood walls designed to protect against floods exceeding the 1997 levels. The project involved raising earthen berms, installing concrete flood walls, and creating pump stations to manage internal drainage when gates were closed. The system extended for miles, encircling the city's vulnerable areas. East Grand Forks underwent similar transformation. The Minnesota side of the river built its own flood protection system. Some neighborhoods, deemed too vulnerable, were not rebuilt. Their former locations became green space and flood storage areas. Buyout programs relocated residents to higher ground. The city's footprint changed permanently. The cost of the disaster exceeded $2 billion in damages. More than 50,000 people were displaced, though most eventually returned. Property losses included approximately 10,000 homes damaged or destroyed in Grand Forks alone. The downtown fire eliminated 11 buildings, representing more than a century of commercial development. Agricultural losses added hundreds of millions more as farmland remained underwater through the spring planting season. Despite the scale of destruction, the flood claimed relatively few lives. Advanced warning systems, though imperfect in predicting the ultimate crest height, provided sufficient time for evacuation. Emergency management protocols functioned effectively. The disaster's human cost manifested more in displacement, property loss, and long-term community disruption than in casualties. The psychological impact extended across years. Returning to a home destroyed by flood involves confronting total loss. Personal belongings accumulated over lifetimes were gone. Photographs, documents, heirlooms, all destroyed by contaminated water. The emotional weight of this loss compounded the practical challenges of rebuilding. Some residents chose not to return, relocating permanently to other communities. The region's recovery proceeded unevenly. Some areas rebuilt quickly, others took years to show signs of renewal. Downtown Grand Forks remained partially vacant long after residential areas had recovered. The economic disruption rippled through the local economy. Businesses that had burned or flooded faced long closures. Some never reopened. Employment patterns shifted as the job base changed. The flood altered the Red River Valley's relationship with its defining geographic feature. Before 1997, the river was understood as occasionally problematic but manageable. After 1997, it became clear that extreme flooding could overwhelm any existing protection and transform the entire valley into an inland sea. This recognition drove substantial investment in flood control infrastructure that continues to protect the region. The new flood protection systems have been tested multiple times since construction. High water events in subsequent years reached levels that would have caused significant flooding without the improved defenses. The infrastructure performed as designed, validating the post-1997 investment. The valley remains vulnerable, but substantially less so than before. The flood of 1997 reshaped Grand Forks physically and psychologically. The city that emerged from the disaster differed from what had existed before. New flood protection systems defined its edges. Neighborhoods had been reconfigured. Downtown had been partially rebuilt with different architectural character. The community had been tested and had survived, but transformation was the price of survival. The memory of that spring remains embedded in the region. Residents who experienced the flood carry detailed recollections. The sight of their street underwater, the smell of river mud, the sound of water moving past their home, the orange glow of downtown burning, the silence of an evacuated city. These memories form part of the community's collective identity. The Red River continues flowing north through one of North America's flattest landscapes. The valley it drains remains fundamentally unchanged by human intervention. The terrain that amplified the 1997 flood still exists, still possesses minimal gradient, still becomes a shallow basin when water exceeds the channel's capacity. Engineering can lessen risk, but it cannot alter the underlying geography. The disaster showed how several factors, exceptional snowfall, rapid warming, frozen ground, ice jams, and a nearly level valley floor, can align to produce a flood of historic scale. Each factor alone would have been manageable. Together, they overwhelmed a region's ability to respond. The flood became a lesson in how rare combinations can push a river beyond every known limit. climate patterns that produced the winter of 1996–1997 fall within natural variability, yet the event's extremity raised questions about recurrence. Hydrological models now treat the 1997 flood as a benchmark for understanding how the Red River behaves under stress. It became the new reference point for floodwalls, diversion channels, and emergency planning across the region. Its lessons extended beyond North Dakota and Minnesota. Other flat river basins across the United States studied the event closely, recognizing that similar conditions could produce comparable outcomes wherever rivers lack gradient and spill easily across surrounding land. The human capacity to rebuild emerged as one of the defining elements of the aftermath. Grand Forks and East Grand Forks lost large sections of their housing, businesses, and infrastructure, yet reconstruction moved forward. Neighborhoods were redesigned. Critical facilities were relocated. The cities remained themselves, though the memory of 1997 became part of their identity. The flat landscape that had made the flood so expansive also influenced the cleanup. Debris did not collect in narrow valleys or against steep terrain. Instead, it spread evenly across wide areas. As water slowly retreated, crews were able to approach each newly exposed section systematically. The geography that magnified the disaster also simplified certain aspects of recovery. The flood occurred during a transitional moment in communication technology. The internet was present but not universal. Cell phones existed but were limited. Information flowed through a mixture of television, radio, newspapers, and early online platforms. The disaster unfolded in near real time for distant observers, which helped mobilize volunteers, but also produced challenges for local officials managing rumors and incomplete reports. Volunteer assistance became one of the clearest expressions of national response. Thousands traveled to the Red River Valley to help fill sandbags, support evacuations, assist in shelters, and participate in cleanup. Their presence reflected both the visible scale of the disaster and the recognition that local resources alone could not meet the need. The sight of a city underwater, streets turned into channels, vehicles submerged, buildings burning in the middle of floodwater, became one of the most striking images of the event. It illustrated how geography and climate can converge in ways that exceed expectations. The same flat terrain that supports agriculture and settlement also allows water to spread without limit once the river escapes its banks. The 1997 Red River flood revealed these truths with exceptional clarity. It transformed one of America's most level regions into a temporary inland sea, took weeks to drain, and required years to recover from. Its legacy endures in reinforced levees, new diversion systems, updated emergency planning, and a broader understanding of how fragile a landscape can become when winter, weather, and geography align unfavorably.